Potato. These nodules are basically smooth brown rocks that exist at the bottom of the ocean, lying on the seabed some 4 kilometers below the surface, what Americans might call either 2.5 miles or a whole bunch of football pitches. But make no mistake, while these nodules may look small and unimpressive on the outside, it's the same way that Mob appears a scrawny, boring middle schooler from afar. Deep inside, both contain a spectacular secret. In Mob's case, it's ESP. In the nodule's case, it's the ability to save the world. The makeup of these nodules, you see, is stuff like cobalt, nickel, and manganese. Minerals that just happen to be absolutely key in building the batteries that are going to dominate the green energy revolution. And this is important because the International Energy Agency predicts a 4-fold increase in demand for these materials by 2040 as humanity struggles to quickly transition off of fossil fuels. The problem is that terrestrial mining may not be able to keep up with the demand. And this is where the nodules come in. Found in rich fields on the seabed, they're particularly clustered in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a 4.5 million square kilometer slice of the Pacific. Now, unfortunately for companies that want to harvest them, it's not quite as simple as just buying a boat, sailing west from California, and making bare profit. No. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the waters outside each nation's exclusive economic zone are places of common heritage. If you want to do any industrial work there, you're going to need the UN's International Seabed Authority to agree. And to get that agreement, you must be sponsored by a recognized nation state. Maybe like a tiny Pacific island in desperate need of cash. As you may have guessed by now, the state Canada's The Metals Company, or TMC, has teamed up with to harvest these nodules is none other than Nauru. Well, technically it's Nauru plus Kiribati and Tonga. But Nauru is especially important, and not just because it was the first nation to come on board. It was also the nation that fired the starting gun on nodule harvesting. The first licenses for exploiting these nodules were granted way back in 2011, but the International Seabed Authority dragged its feet on designing regulations to carry out the work, in large part because of worries about environmental damage. But the ISA's rules include a loophole, one which states that the body must approve official applications within 2 years, even in the absence of regulations. In July of 2021, Nauru went ahead and submitted its application, triggering a 24-month countdown until mining could begin. Now, since you're the sort of intelligent, dashing person who watches these videos, you're already aware that July 2021 was more than 2 years ago. So, you might reasonably ask, what happens with Nauru's application? Well, I'm going to leave you hanging for just a moment. A little mystery there to tantalize you, and we'll be addressing it at the end of the video. But before we get to the end of the video, we do need to grapple with the effects Nauru's application had, why it sparked a wave of global outrage from Fiji to France. The very real worry that deep-sea mining may be this generation's phosphate mining. In other words, that Nauru may have fired the starting gun on a whole additional environmental apocalypse. Now, the process of extracting polymetallic nodules from the seabed is relatively straightforward. To explain it, if not actually to do it. Using heavy machinery, companies will hoover up a whole lot of seabed, collecting the nodules on ships, which will then return them to land for processing. But while that might sound pretty simple, it obscures a whole host of complex issues, not least of which is the way this resource extraction might impact the ocean floor. As the New York Times puts it, to quote, "Scientists say that more is known about the surface of the moon than about the floor of the ocean. Perhaps 90% of the species at the bottom of the Pacific remain unclassified." So that means we can't even begin to predict how removing these nodules will disturb marine ecosystems, even if most scientists are sure that the impacts will be more than negligible. For example, the machinery is likely to churn up sediment at a spectacular rate, potentially destroying fragile habitats. And even if it doesn't, there's the chance that toxic metals will be among those sediments churned up, toxic metals that may be swept upwards in plumes, dragged high into the water to poison marine life forms. Others point to potential for noise from the machinery to damage the ability of whales to communicate with one another, something that could lead to massive disruption in their life cycles. Mostly, though, people are worried that we're going to just go and start destroying something that we don't really understand. And the long-term effects of that could be horrifying. As the New Yorker reported last year, to quote, "Hundreds of marine scientists have signed a statement warning that this would be an ecological disaster resulting in damage irreversible on multi-generational timescales." Now, one of the slightly galling things about this is that this damage won't be happening in Nauru's waters. Situated between Hawaii and Mexico, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is thousands of kilometers from the barren desert of topside. An environmental disaster here would affect many different places. That may be why there's been a concerted push at the UN to place a moratorium on deep-sea mining, a push that includes Pacific states like Fiji, Chile, Panama, Palau, Costa Rica, and New Zealand, but also Atlantic nations like Ireland, France, and Sweden. Standing against them are countries that have already sponsored exploration contracts, countries like China, South Korea, Russia, Jamaica, Brazil, Japan, and France. And yes, France absolutely appeared on both of those lists, talking about having your baguette and eating it too. Now, we need to be clear at this point that the potential impact on the seabed is far from settled science. The metals company, the one Nauru is sponsoring, claims that nodule extraction will be less damaging than land-based mining. The Seabed Authority, meanwhile, is at pains to stress that work will only be allowed in 60% of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. A whole 1.96 million square kilometers is going to be preserved as pristine environment. Yet it may be the official position of Nauru itself that is the most interesting of all, because rather than an economic activity, the Nauruan government describes deep-sea mining as something more existential, a way to save the last habitable part of their damaged nation. With climate change already underway, sea levels are expected to rise in the coming decades. While this is going to suck for everybody, it will be especially awful for low-lying island nations. Although Nauru isn't as low-lying as some, the destruction of topside means that the only inhabitable parts are very close to the waves. According to Nauru's ambassador to the International Seabed Authority, Margot Deye, her country is destined to vanish unless the green transition happens extremely soon. And making the world's economy green is going to require a gigantic increase in certain minerals. Deep-sea mining can help with that. TMC estimates that there are enough nodules down there to power 280 million electric vehicles, 280 million vehicles that would otherwise be farting out planet-frying gases. Or, as Margot Deye has said, the misunderstanding is that any human activity does not have risks. Every activity has risks, but the risk of not doing anything with this current climate crisis is much bigger for us, and it's an existential threat for the Pacific. These, then, are the two sides that stand opposed in this debate. One which believes extracting the seabed's resources could cause a catastrophe, and another that believes that a bigger catastrophe is already happening right now, and we have to do everything we can to try and stop it. As to who's in the right, we can't really say. Unlike George Costanza, we've never claimed to be marine biologists, but what we can say is that the stakes are high. And as we move into the final part of today's video, it is with a massive question hanging over everything. What if we don't figure out who's right until it's already too late? So, when the New York Times did a lot of digging into the contract between TMC and Nauru, what they found didn't exactly paint a flattering picture. According to their reporting, Nauru would receive a tiny fraction of the profits from the deep-sea mining. While the exact amount has never been disclosed, the paper did speak to a community leader from the co-sponsoring nation of Tonga, who said that his country had been offered $2 a ton. Were the same fee applied to Nauru, that would mean the island nation stands to receive less than 0.5% of all profits TMC makes from deep-sea mining. As former Tonga Parliament member Lord Fusitoa told the paper of record, this company set out to game the system and use a poor developing Pacific nation as the conduit to exploit these resources. You might not be surprised to learn that this is a claim TMC vigorously disputes. Nonetheless, such a setup leaves a bad taste in the mouth, reminiscent as it is of Nauru's past exploitation. It also implies that the fight against climate change may just be a convenient fig leaf, a way for Nauru to ensure some much-needed income in the guise of fighting the good fight. With Australia's offshore detention centres coming to an end, the island is about to lose one of its few revenue streams. In such a dire scenario, even a mere 0.5% of whatever TMC makes would have a positive impact on the Nauruan economy. But that's only if the mining ever gets going. You remember back when we said that Nauru had fired the starting on a 2-year countdown to resource extraction back in July of 2021? Well, despite the loophole that should have allowed TMC to start mining by now, the International Seabed Authority managed to delay the process, giving it more time to finalize regulations. As of this recording, it's now thought that no resource extraction will take place until early 2025, later than the 2024 date TMC had initially penciled in, but not remarkably so. And when that date arrives, we're going to finally see for certain what the truth is, whether Nauru is today helping lead the charge toward green energy that'll save our planet, or simply playing a bit part in yet another tale of human greed and ecological disaster, a new topside for the 21st century. The scary part is, we'll probably only know with hindsight, while the destruction of Topside, the wrecking of Nauru, was a tale foretold, it was all too easy to overlook the gloomy predictions in the moment. All too easy for first Arthur F. Ellis, then the Australian colonists, and finally the Nauruan elite to ignore the Cassandras, to quietly tell themselves that by the time the phosphate ran out, they'd have fixed the problem, that the miracles of money would allow them to escape the consequences of their short-sighted actions. It's a tale that everyone watching this will see some horrible parallels in. As Antarctic ice levels drop and oceans overheat, as scientists sound warning alarms, how many of our leaders today act like the Nauruan elite of yore? How many shrug and say, tomorrow's going to take care of itself, even as they ensure that tomorrow will be anything but fine? And now here we are, with deep sea mining, potentially standing at the edge of another catastrophe. Another moment when a narrow elite adds up the cost and decides that the benefits to them outweigh the risk to everyone else. It's reasons like this that explain why Nauru's story resonates so strongly. The story of how the richest country in the world destroyed itself. Fittingly, it's a resonance the Nauruans themselves are only too aware of. Back in 2011, then-President Marcus Stephan wrote a guest column for The Times where he set out the parable of Nauru's self-inflicted apocalypse. It reads, "I'm not looking for sympathy, but rather warning you what can happen when a country runs out of options. The world is headed down a similar path with the relentless burning of coal and oil, which is altering the planet's climate, melting ice caps, making oceans more acidic, and edging us ever closer to a day when no one will be able to take clean water, fertile soil, or abundant food for granted. I forgive you if you've never heard of Nauru, but you will not forgive yourselves if you ignore our story." It's a story that, over 12 years later, is more relevant to our planet's future than it ever has been. Deep in the heart of the Indian Ocean, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continental landmass, lies the humble islands of Diego Garcia. A modest ring-shaped atoll of just over 30 kilometers square in total land area, Diego Garcia snakes through the water like any one of the hundreds of similar islands scattered around the world. View it from 30,000 feet and it might seem so tiny, so utterly inconsequential that it only exists at all because no wave has yet to come to sweep it away. But the story of Diego Garcia is not just the story of any old island. From its early settlement by France and then by the British East India Company, to the expulsion of a community who had made the atoll their home for generations, to the immense geopolitical relevance of Diego Garcia in the modern world, the island has been a lightning rod for controversy for the better part of 3 centuries. And in today's episode of Places, we're going to tell a story that winds through indentured servitude, forced exile, military occupation, WikiLeaks, environmental conservation, and even an alleged CIA black site, all in service to the island of Diego Garcia. Now, the voyage to Diego Garcia is an arduous one, no matter what way you slice it. Embark on a journey to the island from the Tanzanian coastline, and you have to sail a ship over 3,500 kilometers of nearly entirely empty ocean. Set sail from Australia, and the journey's even longer, just short of 5,000 kilometers. Your best bet, though, is to leave from the city of Kanyakumari in India. But even then, you'll sail a line nearly directly south for 1,800 kilometers before you can finally set foot on dry land. Diego Garcia is a coral atoll situated on the southernmost tip of a massive underwater mountain range. Along that range, you'll find the Maldives, the Indian island chain of Lakshadweep, and the Chagos Archipelago, of which Diego Garcia is the largest among some 60 individual islands. On the scale of global atolls, a type of ring-shaped coral-rimmed island encircling a lagoon, Diego Garcia is actually the largest in the world. However, that certainly doesn't mean that it is large, although it occupies about 174 square kilometers in total. Just a small portion of that, 27 square kilometers or 10 square miles, are actually dry land. Circling around a large central lagoon in a shape that, if you squint a bit, looks almost like a bent version of Greenland, Diego Garcia is no more than a couple of hundred meters wide in some parts. The atoll, plus a few scattered islands in the immediate vicinity, sit barely above the surface of the sea, enduring frequent earthquakes that at times can measure at a 4 or higher on the Richter scale. Now, perhaps the most pleasant way to imagine Diego Garcia is to see it almost as a vacation spot. Its equatorial climate is warm all day and all night, hitting around 30 degrees Celsius, 86 Fahrenheit on the warmest days of the year, and despite its humidity, the island is washed in a constant westerly breeze that rarely ventures above 10 knots. It's got a clear wet season, dry season. Thunderstorms typically sweep through the area on summer evenings, and as far as extreme weather goes, it's at almost no risk of cyclones compared to most of the Indian Ocean. There are no mountains or cliff faces to navigate either. The highest point on the atoll is 22 feet. That's 7 meters above sea level. Rainwater can be easily collected in cisterns or taken from a few natural depressions, and what little inland area exists on Diego Garcia is largely overtaken by tropical wetlands with the occasional marsh or scrublands. The outer-facing and lagoon-facing edges, of course, feature enough sandy beaches to make a sunbather weep with joy. Now, the story of Diego Garcia is the story of an island that has been fundamentally altered by the presence of humans. But in order to really understand that story in full, we've got to first take a look at what the island would have been like before people showed up. Diego Garcia was completely uninhabited before their discovery by Portuguese explorer Pedro Mascarenhas, although it may have been host to the occasional stranded prehistoric fishermen or have been visited by Austronesian or Arab voyagers. As we've just described, the atoll is teeming with plant life, but like many of the islands of this area, there are no mammal, land reptile, or amphibian species native to Diego Garcia. Instead, it's a critical breeding ground for seabirds and both hawksbill and green turtles, but while its beaches are ruled by the surprisingly hefty coconut crab and the warrior crab, it's one small part of a sprawling oceanic ecosystem, one that likely existed without much change for millennia before humans finally arrived. Now, after Pedro Mascarenhas and his ship arrived to the atoll in 1512, the first order of business was to give the place a name. Now, it wouldn't have been a bad guess when you first started watching this video to think that maybe the island of Diego Garcia was named after a dude called Diego Garcia, but Actually, no, the atoll was first dubbed Dom Garcia in honor of the Portuguese nobleman Garcia de Noronha, the benefactor who had funded Pedro Mascarenhas' voyage. Although the atoll was largely forgotten after Mascarenhas' departure, the Garcia name came back in 1544 when another explorer rediscovered it. That guy's name was actually Diego Garcia, specifically Diego Garcia de Moga, and he named the island after himself, leading to a lot of confusion on maps of the time. Making matters worse, a prominent map that did depict the atoll featured a misspelled note in the area of the islands, which was to say Dio Gracias, or thank God, and even though the first English language map that depicted the island called it Diego Garcia, this was likely a misreading of either Di Gracia or Dio Gracia on a Portuguese language map. By this time, the atoll had already stumbled its way into the name of Diego Garcia, and when that name was picked up by subsequent map makers, it just became as good as official. All this is just to disabuse you of the thought that prior generations of explorers had their shit together. Regardless of the name it carried, Diego Garcia went uninhabited until the late 1770s. By then, the atoll and the rest of the Chagos archipelago were under the administration of the French, and a short-lived settlement cropped up there, courtesy of one Monsieur Dupit de la Fay. As best as historians can tell, not much went on in this settlement, except for a bit of fishing and coconut collecting, which, now that we think of it, is not a euphemism, but it really should be, right? French surveyors had found the atoll somewhat useless in terms of an expanded settlement. In the words of one Lieutenant Lafontaine, who appraised the island in 1770, quote, "A great number of vessels might anchor there," meaning in Diego Garcia's lagoon, "but the principal object is wanting. For though it is covered with woods, it is not provided with fresh water." By 1786, Diego Garcia's early settlers were already gone, and so the atoll was abandoned when, in that year, the British East India Company came calling. Despite their attempt to settle the islands with an initial community of nearly 275 people, a nearby shipwreck of another East India Company ship all but doomed the settlement when another 250 survivors clambered ashore, desperately in need of food and water. By now, travelers to the area had already learned that shipwrecks were common on the great underwater reefs that surrounded the atoll at this time. The castaways' drain on supplies ended up making the settlement untenable, and the East India Company too picked up and left. France had actually sent a naval frigate to try and boot the British off the islands, but by the time it arrived, they were already gone. Next, Diego Garcia was a destination used by the French colony of Mauritius, who decided to maroon some lepers there, and a few years later France moved back in, this time bringing slave labor to the atoll in an effort to start a coconut plantation. 2 ships, each carrying some 25 men as well as slaves, were able to establish themselves on the islands and form a profitable settlement, this one producing sun-dried coconut flesh or copra and coconut oil. With their success, more oil manufacturers arrived, and after Mauritius continued to send lepers to the island, it developed several smaller communities, including a leper colony. By 1814, Diego Garcia passed from French control into British hands for good, courtesy of the Treaty of Paris, which ceded a number of French territories over to the Crown after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. By then, the atoll had already proven its worth as a small plantation colony, and it was split into several different plantations across the island: East Point, Mini, and Point Marianne, with small pockets of workers scattered in villages across the rest of the island. Now, fortunately for the Diego Garcia ecosystem, but rather predictably, the advent of large-scale plantation farming led to much of the island's wetland forests being razed to the ground and a number of new plant and animal species being introduced to the island. Although we don't know exactly when each new species was introduced, we know that there are today about 280 terrestrial plant species on the islands, compared to 36 that would have been there prior to the introduction of humans and rats, Sicilian donkeys, horses, dogs, house cats, cane toads, and chickens, which formed their own version of the Diego Garcia ecosystem, granted on top of the one that existed before. With the arrival of the British came the British policy of abolition of the slave trade, but with so many former slaves now out of work and without other means to support themselves or leave, they were kept on as indentured servants, working these same plantations as before. The island was surveyed and developed further, and with its high potential to generate coconut oil compared to the relatively few resources that it demanded, Diego Garcia became more and more profitable. Judging by the available data on how much coconut oil was being produced at the time, it's likely that nearly the entire island was overtaken by growing operations, and it was able to ship out several times more of its product than comparably sized islands in the area. By 1883, the 3 plantations on the island had been united under the command of a single manager, a man named James Spurs, who instituted strict policies on liquor consumption, sent quota expectations through the roof, and was apparently able to keep the island in check, mostly owing to what period sources describe as his competency and benevolence towards the island workers. Around this same time, portions of the island were set aside as coal depots for ships making the long journey across the Indian Ocean, with some 180 ships a year being fueled within a couple of years of the operation's start. So as not to infringe on the work of the plantations there, visiting ships were prohibited from allowing their crews and passengers to set foot on the island other than to refuel, but these guidelines were quickly and frequently violated by large ships filled with migrants whose crews had trouble keeping everyone hemmed in when land was in sight. The rise in unlawful entries led to the establishment of a police force, which in turn exacerbated the labor disputes already ongoing between the plantations and their workers. In the words of one G.C. Bourne, who visited the island in 1886, speaking about a friend who had visited previously, quote, "Mr. LeConte told me that on his arrival on the island 3 years ago, he found the Negroes in a most insubordinate condition, and that within a month of landing, his veranda was besieged by a body of 30 men armed with knives and bludgeons who declared that they would not leave the place until they had taken his life. Luckily for him, they were as cowardly as they were insolent, and he was able to keep them at bay, presenting a revolver until he had succeeded in reducing them to a more reasonable state of mind." End quote. We can only imagine in retrospect what the context behind such an act may have been, and what the actual objective of 30 armed, organized plantation workers may have been. It wasn't long after this point that coaling operations on Diego Garcia were shut down. Not only had they led to turmoil on the islands, but the whole endeavor had been unprofitable too, and before long, the atoll was strictly dedicated to providing coconut products again. A chapel was built on Diego Garcia, then a church, then a jetty and light railway, and then a center of commerce at East Point, in a sign of the growing economic stability, or even economic power of the little island. New technologies made the Diego Garcia plantations favor production of copper instead of coconut oil, and by this time, it's believed that production was reaching its eventual maximum. Some 5.3 million coconuts yielded per year, just about half the coconut production of the entire British Indian Ocean territory. But coconuts weren't the only reason that Diego Garcia mattered at the turn of the 20th century. With global war on the horizon, its spacious lagoon, located way out in the middle of nowhere, was a perfect oceanic anchorage for any one of the world's major powers to, say, park a battleship or two in advance of major hostilities. In 1899, the atoll hosted the German warships Bismarck and Marie, and the British warship Hampshire. And after the war broke out in 1914, a German ship, the Emden, stopped over at Diego Garcia to refuel and clean while it was being chased by English warships. Although Diego Garcia was very much a British protectorate at that time, and thus on the other side of the war, word hadn't yet reached the island that there was a war at all, so the Emden's damage was explained away as having come from storms, and its officers were wined and dined before departing in advance of their British pursuers. By and large, World War I avoided the Indian Ocean, and Diego Garcia was otherwise not involved in the conflict, but in World War II, it was used to support naval craft, refuel flying boats like the Catalina, and otherwise keep British operations going in the area. Now, until this point, Diego Garcia had been a quiet, stable settlement that was, if not frozen in time, then at least resistant to change. Increased productivity had raised the overall quality of life on the atoll. The occasional visitors by sea had added to island life in both positive and negative ways, but all told, the status quo on Diego Garcia hadn't substantively changed in well over 100 years. Through modernization, through abolition, through the Great Depression, and through 2 world wars, Diego Garcia carried on as it always had. But it was the arrival of the Cold War that would change everything on Diego Garcia, not in those first few desperate years of factional alignment and nuclear development, but in the years that immediately followed the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1965, the British government detached Diego Garcia and the rest of the Chagos archipelago from the oversight of Mauritius, and instead incorporated it into the British Indian Ocean territory, just in time for it to be subject to an agreement made with the United States. According to this pact, both nations would share free, unrestricted use of the British Indian Ocean territory for military purposes for a period of at least 50 years. As we'd mentioned before, Diego Garcia has had the potential to be militarily significant since it was first chartered. If, say, fuel could be stored there or supplies, it could be a valuable depot way out in the ocean, and its large lagoon ensured that numerous ships could potentially stay over. But in an era of ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, and ships with ranges up to thousands of kilometers before refueling, plus the arrival of the first nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, an island like this was a massive strategic asset for whoever controlled it. Similar to how Soviet ties to the island of Cuba made it a regional player in the affairs of Central and South America, a US-UK-controlled naval base at Diego Garcia could allow both nations to extend their influence all up and down East Africa, South Asia, the Philippines, and Australia. Not only that, but it could serve as a valuable home base in American efforts to interdict Russian oil moving out of the Persian Gulf. With Vietnam War still very much an active conflict, plus a whole range of other unfriendly nations in the area, the value of a militarized Diego Garcia was apparently too great to ignore. But after they signed their compact with the Americans, the British military didn't stay for very long. In 1968, Britain had made public its intent to withdraw from all military holdings east of the Suez Canal, including not just Malaysia and Singapore, but Diego Garcia as well. Although this decision was ultimately an unavoidable one for the waning British Empire, beset as they were by a stark economic decline and forced to recalibrate toward Europe, it had the collateral effect of raising questions about what an Indian Ocean without Britain's influence would even look like. This so-called vacuum in the Indian Ocean didn't last for long because, after all, the United States and the Soviet Union both had something of a reflexive reaction to send military assets to any corner of the world that didn't seem sufficiently involved in their global standoff. Predictably, this turned into yet another small arms race in a war of many arms races, and by the time Britain left the area, the Americans and the Soviets had more than filled in the gaps. Diego Garcia was a particularly thorny issue during this time on both sides of the divide. American logic at the time held that the Soviets would try anything to keep America from establishing a large-scale naval presence, for which Diego Garcia was something of an ideal center if it could be consistently resupplied, while the Soviets were particularly concerned about the US turning the atoll into a communications base. If that were to happen, the Soviets believed, then it would be because Diego Garcia had become a command and control center to coordinate the operations of ballistic missile submarines in the Indian Ocean, submarines whose missiles would, of course, be pointed at the Soviet Union. America never acknowledged whether or not these submarines were present. Russia began dispatching its own warships to the Indian Ocean much more frequently, and the vacuum in the Indian Ocean quickly became the least of anyone's concerns. Now, even with all of this upheaval in the region, Diego Garcia's plantations have been able to survive, harvesting coconuts and churning out copper oil at an average of 4 million nuts a year. But all of that changed on January the 23rd, 1971, when a 9-man team from the US Navy arrived to survey potential locations for a beach landing. Within 2 months, those 9 men would swell to over 200, clearing beaches, installing navigational aids for incoming ships, and mapping the underwater areas under both the lagoon and the seas surrounding Diego Garcia. By March the 24th, 1971, the Navy broke ground on its so-called US Naval Communication Facility Diego Garcia, along with a nearby runway, first an interim version and later a fully functional permanent military airstrip. Then, full construction began, and any Diego Garcia inhabitants who might have thought this would only be a minor change to their way of life were quickly disabused of that optimism. Transmitter buildings, receiver buildings, a full military encampment, and the atoll's permanent runway were all under construction by the end of the year, and on Christmas Day 1971, the Bob Hope Christmas troop arrived aboard a C-141J cargo transport, breaking in the runway for a good bit of caroling. But as the US Navy Seabees were enjoying their hot cocoa, the people of Diego Garcia and the Chagos Archipelago were suffering a very different fate. By the time Bob Hope's singers landed, most Chagosian inhabitants of Diego Garcia were already gone, with their entire population of about 1,500 islanders picked up and taken elsewhere. And we must be absolutely clear here that this wasn't a willful or even compensated departure for the islanders. It was a forced expulsion. Starting in 1965, the Diego Garcia Islanders had been systematically rounded up, processed, and directed to leave the island. First Britain, and then the US, declared that all Chagosians who were not on Diego Garcia at the time of their arrival would not be able to return regardless of the reason they had left. Not only that, but those remaining on the islands were informed that they could not seek employment with the incoming naval base in order to stay. Then, a regime of import restrictions was used to create scarcity all up and down the atoll, taking away not just frivolous goods, but fundamental ones. Then, the threats began. The islanders' beloved pet dogs were rounded up and killed with a mix of poison, gas, burning, and bullets. Their homes were demolished, as ordered by British Commissioner of the Indian Ocean Territory, and carried out with the direct assistance of the US Navy. Finally, 1971's Immigration Ordinance No. 1 was passed, prohibiting all Chagosians from entering or remaining on the islands. When the time for evictions finally came, the Chagosians were mostly transported in the cargo holds of rusted-out ships, with some accounts of the islanders being forced to sleep on bird fertilizer. It should go without saying that this alone, done by British administrations to mostly black populations whose ancestors had come to Diego Garcia as slaves, was already reminiscent of a long history of slavery and forced expulsion. Taken to the Seychelles, they were detained for a time until the British government decided what was to be done with them, and once a decision was made, they were loaded up again and shipped to Mauritius. There, instead of the homes and the jobs they were promised, they found broken down, dilapidated housing, formerly used by dock workers with no access to clean water or electricity. Interviews with those who have survived, done by journalist John Pilger for Al Jazeera, describe the death of no fewer than 26 of Diego Garcia's families in those conditions, at least 9 suicides and several instances of girls being forced into sex work on Mauritius in order to feed their families. Their predicament wouldn't even be minimally addressed until 1982, a full decade or more after most had left Diego Garcia, and in the same year that Britain went to great lengths to protect and transport a roughly equivalent number of white islanders from the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. In that year, demonstrations by the Diego Garcia Islanders in 1982 earned them compensation of less than £3,000 each. In exchange for those payments, Chagosians from not just Diego Garcia, but the entire archipelago were expected to sign or thumbprint documents that gave up their rights to return to the archipelago. Those documents, written in English and using legal terms that were never explained to the Chagosians, were apparently more than enough for the British government to feel as if they'd washed their hands of the matter. And even this, for the Chagosians of Mauritius, was better than what waited for those who sought refuge in the Seychelles. They, a population of 232, received nothing. So, returning to the island of Diego Garcia itself, the removal of the Chagosians set off a full militarization of the atoll. Within a couple of years of their departure, the naval base there featured an 8,000-foot runway plus supply depots, personnel accommodations, and logistical support infrastructure. The lagoon was cleared out of obstructions, including coral reefs, in order to form a ship channel and a turning basin, and the airport was dramatically expanded to store aircraft for the long term. A few years later, the island was designated a Navy support facility, and its runway was expanded to 12,000 feet in order to accommodate the largest aircraft of America's military arsenal. Its lagoon, now partially built into a harbor, was expanded and used to dock a permanent fleet of some 17 ships, all loaded up with enough equipment, ammunition, and other supplies to support a marine amphibious brigade on a moment's notice for crisis response. In many ways, the size and scale of operations on Diego Garcia were a reaction of the many setbacks that the US faced around that time, a long list of which happens within relative proximity to the islands. The fall of Saigon, the victory of the Khmer Rouge, Soviet buildup in the region, and more, all clarified to the United States and the United Kingdom that anything less than an island version of a citadel risked a sort of unpreparedness in the region that the US was unwilling to stomach. After the Iranian Revolution and the Iran hostage crisis, the US relied on Diego Garcia to host heavy bombers and dozens of ships, including some of the largest naval vessels in the world, plus storage for well over 1 million barrels of fuel. And when US bases in the Philippines closed in the early 1990s, the base only got bigger. During the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Diego Garcia was placed optimally to support the global coalition's response and achieved a level of operational readiness throughout the conflicts that went well above and beyond what the military or the rest of the world had expected. Diego Garcia was the only naval base to launch offensive operations during Operation Desert Storm, and its personnel were able to handle up to a 2,000% increase in their workload during the crisis without missing a beat. So too was it a launchpad for air operations in Afghanistan, with heavy bombers and tankers completing an 8,000-mile round trip in order to get it done. Far from being a deterrent, that 8,000-mile trip was the one most favored by the US military, and Diego Garcia's coalition aircraft dropped more ordnance on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban than any other US military unit during the entire war on terror. The island even hosted high-tech B-2 Spirit bombers in specialized climate control shelters, and at times had some of the highest concentrations of B-2s in the world. Now today, Diego Garcia remains under the control of the US military and under the ownership of the United Kingdom. Amidst rising tensions with China, escalation between India and Pakistan, and innumerable crises in Africa and Asia, the base on Diego Garcia is an increasingly important asset for the United States and its Western partners, one of only a few major bases in that part of the world. Personnel stationed there live without their families present, reliant on back-and-forth flights to Singapore for transit in and out, and expected to hop onto one of those flights to receive things like dental care. The island does have a 9-hole golf course, though, so, well, that's something, we suppose. However, the question of what's being kept on Diego Garcia has a lot less to do with the golf course, has a lot more to do with nuclear weapons. The United States has a long-standing policy of not confirming or denying whether nuclear weapons are present aboard its aircraft, naval vessels, and ballistic missile submarines. But with so many nuclear-capable assets stationed there, it seems rather unlikely that not a single warhead would ever have passed across Diego Garcia's sandy shores. The African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty claims to cover Diego Garcia, but neither the US nor the UK agree with that interpretation, and neither government has ever clarified whether nuclear weapons have ever been stored there. And nukes aren't the only unwelcome visitors on Diego Garcia either, or at least not allegedly. In 2015, a former colonel of the US Army, Lawrence Wilkerson, claims that Diego Garcia had been used by the American Central Intelligence Agency for what he called nefarious activities. Wilkerson, who had until recently served as Chief of Staff to US Secretary of State Colin Powell, gave this cryptic quote to Vice News. "What I heard was more along the lines of using it as a transit location when perhaps other places were full or other places were deemed too dangerous or insecure or unavailable at the moment. So you might have a case where you simply go in and use a facility at Diego Garcia for a month or 2 weeks or whatever, and you do your nefarious activities there." End quote. What Wilkerson was referring to was the kidnap and torture program used by the CIA in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. Essentially, Wilkerson alleged that Diego Garcia was, or is, home to a CIA black site, a location where undisclosed or hidden projects or programs are conducted away from the public eye. According to the United Nations, the CIA is believed to have formed at least 20 black sites around the world since 9/11, and potentially even more. At these sites, global observers allege detainees are tortured brutally in ways that we're not going to go into here. And if you'd like to learn more about the CIA's alleged practices in general, do check out our sister channel, Into the Shadows. We've covered it a couple of times. By the time Wilkerson made his statements, enough people around the world had heard of a CIA black site on Diego Garcia that a number of international sources were compelled to speak out. A UN official, Manfred Nowak, added that sometimes CIA detainees are held and tortured on US ships in the Indian Ocean. One terrorist, known as Mbali, who was believed to have been involved in a 2002 bombing in Bali that killed 202 people, is believed to have spent 2 months on Diego Garcia. Human rights organizations had also dug around on their own and found that at least 2 aircraft known to be involved with the CIA's rendition program flew in and out of the Diego Garcia airstrip. Most damning of all, US sources testified that a CIA report on its own use of torture presented to the US Senate Intelligence Committee referenced its use of Diego Garcia multiple times. As more information came out about the rumored black site, the world learned that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called principal architect of 9/11, spent time there while in CIA custody. Whether that site still exists today, we don't know. But when a US Senate intelligence report was released in 2014 detailing the CIA's torture programs, Diego Garcia was never mentioned. We'll leave it to you to assume whether that means the site never existed at all, or whether it was deemed important enough to keep hidden for later use. And then there's the continued efforts of the Chagosian population and their backers to return to Diego Garcia and the surrounding islands, efforts that have been consistently rebuffed by both the US and the UK. Although Britain's High Court in London ruled their expulsion illegal in 2000, Tony Blair's government avoided repercussions by bypassing the courts with an archaic trick of the monarchy, and when the High Court ruled that Chagosians should be allowed to return to their home, the British Foreign Office successfully appealed the decision. In the words of journalist John Pilger, who we mentioned earlier, "I was in the House of Lords, where the court then sat on the day of the judgment. I've never seen such shamefaced judges in what was clearly a political decision." As if that wasn't enough, the British government then went on to add insult to injury, attempting to insulate themselves further against a Chagosian return by attempting to designate the waters around the archipelago as a nature reserve. This action, along with many others of the time, was revealed via a WikiLeaks dump that published a 2009 cable from a US embassy about the issue. In that cable, the embassy directly stated that the establishment of a marine reserve would be, quote, "the most effective long-term way to prevent any of the Chagos Islands' former inhabitants or descendants from resettling." These revelations were confirmed with the exposure of another cable in which the British government wrote, "The establishment of a marine park, the world's largest, would in no way impinge on USG use of BART." And a note here, that's the British Indian Ocean Territory, including Diego Garcia for military purposes, end quote. And later in the same document, quote, "The BART's former inhabitants would find it difficult, if not impossible, to pursue their claim for resettlement on the islands if the entire Chagos archipelago were a marine reserve," end quote. This reserve, the Chagos Marine Protected Area, was declared in 2010, although it was ruled illegal by The Hague in 2015 and dissolved. In the following years, Mauritius would go to war with Britain over ownership of the Chagos archipelago, supported by their close ally India, and claims that the islands should have been reverted to Mauritian control. But in terms of its potential impact on the Chagosian islanders in exile, Mauritius isn't much of a better alternative. The Mauritian envoy to the United Nations has claimed that if Mauritius did regain sovereignty over the archipelago, Chagosians would be allowed back to some of the islands, but not Diego Garcia itself. Instead, they'd be placed on 3 islands over 100 miles away. The archipelago features prominently in Mauritius's own internal squabble, specifically between 2 political dynasties who have passed power back and forth in the last few decades. Whoever gets back sovereignty over the islands can lease Diego Garcia back to the Americans and make a whole lot of money while also opening up a fishing route that's currently closed off. And even after all of this, there's yet more controversy to discuss around Diego Garcia, specifically a conspiracy theory naming the atoll as the final resting place of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, which disappeared on the 8th of March 2014 while en route from Malaysia to China. The incident, still unexplained to this day, sparked mass speculation on what might have happened to the flight, and Diego Garcia has played a rather prominent role. In an exploration of the MH370 pilot's personal belongings, investigators discovered that he had programmed the location of Diego Garcia and its landing strip into his home flight simulator. The reason why he may have done so is unknown. Other theories range from the digitally vulnerable Boeing 777 having been taken over by hackers to the flight being shot down by the United States when the pilot hypothetically brought it close to the island for his own purposes. The island has also hosted a group of migrants for nearly 2 years after a fishing boat was intercepted near the island in October 2021. Struggling to move under its own power, the boat was stuffed with 89 Sri Lankan Tamils who claimed they were fleeing persecution at home. According to maps, diary entries, and GPS coordinates found aboard the boat, its passengers had believed that they would be able to make it to Canada and seek asylum, but ran into rough weather and were forced to sail toward the nearest source of light. But after arriving on the islands and being placed into temporary accommodation, these 89 people have basically been swallowed up by the base there. Unsuccessful in lobbying the commander of British forces on Diego Garcia for safe passage elsewhere, they have since lived in makeshift tent encampments with reports of suicide attempts, sexual assaults, and rampant mental and physical health concerns among the migrants. They've also started to get company with other boats in similar situations, either intentionally or unintentionally ending up seeking help from Diego Garcia in the intervening months. With many of the migrants there claiming fears for their own safety if they were to go back to Sri Lanka, in part due to some of their past affiliations with the Tamil Tigers organization, their situation is in limbo, and hunger strikes, even one involving the children at their encampments, have not led to any change for the 60 or so people who haven't yet been sent elsewhere. Said one migrant when quoted by the BBC, "We are the parrots. We are in a cage." As for where things on Diego Garcia stand now, it's worth returning once more to the plight of the Diego Garcia Islanders and the other Chagosians who were expelled from their homes now over 50 years ago. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch released a comprehensive report detailing their forced removal from their island homes and the degree to which the Chagosians had been deeply established on the islands prior to removal with their own language, culture, and music. All this contrasted with Britain's claims at the time of removal that no people lived permanently on the Chagos archipelago. The report brought these survivors and their families back into public consciousness, and calls for full reparations drew a response from both the US and UK governments, although neither nation expressed any interest in a more comprehensive redress than what had been already done. This, according to the UK government, includes limited payments, education, community support, and sponsored trips back to the Chagosian archipelago to visit. Not nothing, but not even slightly the same as an actual plan to address the repercussions of Britain's actions. With such a painful history, such a complex and shrouded situation in the present day, and so seemingly few points of compromise between the United States, the United Kingdom, Mauritius, India, and the Chagosians themselves, it looks as if the deeply uncomfortable set of compromises and realities around Diego Garcia will remain unchanged in the years to come. With American and British standing in the nations around the Indian Ocean only growing more contentious, it's unlikely that either nation would willfully relinquish their hold on the island, and so long as they keep it, the ancestral home of the Chagosian people will remain permanently out of their reach. It'll take a miracle to change that balance now, and for all of the countless things that seem to weigh Diego Garcia down, miracles certainly aren't among them. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, I'm your host Simon. I'm here, one of my writers. This case, Ilza. Thank you, Ilza. Has written me a script, Who Are the Sea Peoples? Keeping it simple with that title. Are these the people who randomly arrived in the Mediterranean, wiped out civilizations or something? That's literally all I know about this, even though I'm pretty sure that I must have touched on this in videos in the past because it's super famous. But anyway, the point of the show, if you're brand new here, is I'm going to read this script. I've never read it before. You and I, dear audience member, are going to learn something together. Let's go. On a bright, clear morning, a couple of thousand years ago, a young man strolling along the beach looked out over the deep blue ocean, and his breath caught in his throat. He almost collapsed to his knees, but the thought of his beautiful wife and the happy cries of his newborn son gave him wings. His heart pounding, he fled to report a sight that left him in a cold sweat, praying to gods he never believed in, as many a desperate man had done before. Leaning against the doorpost, trembling in fear, he managed to stammer out the dreaded news. They are here. The feared sea people, the scourge of the Mediterranean, who had left every port they visited in flame and ruin, had finally arrived. Yeah, it's like, what's that famous quote? Like, everyone's an atheist until they're like on their deathbed or whatever. And was it what's his face? The other famous atheist who isn't Richard Dawkins. He's also British. Christopher Hitchens. Big brain. Didn't he say, like, because he was dying of, like, lung cancer or something, and then he was like, yeah, if I'm on my deathbed and I say that, you know, I say something about, like, believing in God or whatever, ignore me, because I'm on so many drugs or whatever. Just ignore me. It's not true. I never will. I don't. But it's like, yeah, that, like, moment of, like, I've never been, like, close to death, but I have had one truly terrifying experience. And I was in a cable car. And I'm sure everything was completely fine. But I was just sitting in this cable car, going up this mountain in like some random place in China. And this cable car just starts. It's not like it's not like a big cable car with loads of people. It's just me and a couple of others. And we're in this cable car. And it just starts making these... and we're over like a massive gorge. And it just starts from the like where the cable car attaches the wire. It's just like a... just making these crazy sounds. And I'm just like, it's the only time in my life where I've really like been, am I in a dream? Is this a dream? Is this a nightmare? And I'm like pinching myself and I'm like, nope, this is reality. You're in a cable car that is making some crazy ass noises while you are fully over a gorge. And I'm like, oh Jesus, if you do exist, save me. I know I've not been good. I don't believe in you. And I'm atheist. It's like, what's that famous quote? Like, everyone's an atheist until they're like on their deathbed or whatever. And was it what's his face? The other famous atheist who isn't Richard Dawkins. He's also British. Christopher Hitchens. Big brain. Didn't he say, like, because he was dying of like lung cancer or something, and then he was like, yeah, if I'm on my deathbed and I say that, you know, I say something about like believing in God or whatever, ignore me, because I'm on so many drugs or whatever. Just ignore me. It's not true. I never will. I don't. But it's like, yeah, that like moment of like I've never been like close to death, but I have had one truly terrifying experience. And I was in a cable car. And I'm sure everything was completely fine. But I was just sitting in this cable car, going up this mountain in like some random place in China. And this cable car just starts. It's not like it's not like a big cable car with loads of people. It's just me and a couple of others. And we're in this cable car. And it just starts making these... and we're over like a massive gorge. And it just starts from the like where the cable car attaches the wire. It's just like a... just making these crazy sounds. And I'm just like, it's the only time in my life where I've really like been, am I in a dream? Is this a dream? Is this a nightmare? And I'm like pinching myself and I'm like, nope, this is reality. You're in a cable car that is making some crazy ass noises while you are fully over a gorge. And I'm like, oh Jesus, if you do exist, save me. I know I've not been good. I don't believe in you. But no. Do I believe in that stuff? No. But do I believe like in that like moment of like, oh, sure. I mean, I understand why it happens, because you're like, well, not really anything I can do here. Might as well pray.
Everything's going to be okay.
The gangsters of the late Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples, instilled terror in all those who happened to cross their path. They cut a swath of destruction across the Mediterranean and into the Near East, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. But who were these enigmatic marauders? Were they merciless pirates, one of the horsemen announcing the end of the Bronze Age, or were they victims of circumstance themselves? Well, let's find out. The Bronze Age collapse. On the shores of the Mediterranean, from present-day Greece all the way to the golden sands of Egypt, once rose a mighty global community, shining as brightly as the age that they're known for. The Bronze Age, lasting from 3300 BCE to 1200 BCE, was a time of advancement and prosperity that saw the rise of some of the greatest ancient empires. Mycenae and Minoa in Greece, the Great Hittite Empire, covering central Turkey, northwestern Syria, and upper Mesopotamia at its height, and in the south, the great and powerful Egypt, with its grand pyramids, and the fertile Nile Delta. the shadow of its power reaching all the way to the southern tip of what we know today as Syria. The Late Bronze Age saw a time of relative peace with minor upheavals, with the great powers maintaining complex diplomatic relations and trade agreements. Cuneiform tablets found in the ruins of Agarit show a wealth of correspondence between the young and, sadly, last king of Ugarit, the last king of the Hittite Empire, and Pharaoh Menemta in Egypt, providing a rare glimpse into the workings of a truly global community. Perhaps not global by today's standards, but the globe was considered to be quite a bit smaller back then. Yeah, isn't that the thing with Alexander the Great? It's like he conquered the known world. And they're like, yeah, great one, Alexander. So you conquered basically a bit of stuff around the Mediterranean. I mean, I know it was like different back then. How much did Alexander the Great actually conquer? It wasn't that much if you looked at the whole globe, but it was literally all anyone knew. The political systems of the day were based on royalty and an aristocratic class with social hierarchies that led to specialized professions and trade goods of outstanding quality. Copper and tin, the main components for bronze, were prized commodities. The various kingdoms and empires relied on their allies to supply them with whatever resources they lacked through trade. Advancements were made in art, architecture, technology, and warfare, with armies comprising of professional soldiers instead of bands of raiders or farmers defending their lands and homes with little more than pitchforks and a bit of enthusiasm. It was a prosperous time that benefited everybody. And then suddenly, it all collapsed. Wait, were the Sea People responsible for the collapse of the Bronze Age? Is that what they're famous for? Is that why it's so famous? I think that's right? That's kind of crazy. And if I remember, nobody knows who they are. So, what was the episode of this? Who were the Sea People? I get the feeling we're not going to find out unless Ilza has uncovered something incredible that historians are now going to reference. Around 1250 BCE to 1150 BCE, the great Mediterranean civilizations came crashing down in quick succession. Researchers agree that it's unlikely that a single factor led to the Bronze Age collapse, and it's rare for academics to agree on anything. According to one researcher, Eric Klein, the Mediterranean civilizations faced a perfect storm of disasters. Localized disasters like earthquakes or volcanoes didn't just affect the immediate surroundings. Due to the close trade relations between the various powers, if one area was struck by a disaster, all those relying on it suffered as well. Other disasters, like a mega drought lasting from around 1250 to 1100 BCE, were more widespread and led to crop failures. Egypt's reliance on the Great Nile River was quite possibly its only saving grace. Crop failures and food shortages led to internal strife and upheaval as commoners set out to bring down the upper classes, high in their ivory towers with plenty of food, while the masses were starving. Malnutrition led to compromised immune systems, which led to disease, and with the peasants and slaves dying, no one was left to plant or harvest, leaving the fields bare. With one disaster striking after the other, without any time to recover, the great cities and finally the great empires fell like dominoes. Into this chaos sailed the Sea Peoples. Okay, so it wasn't the Sea Peoples that caused this. All the was going down and the Sea Peoples were like, hello there. It looks like you're ripe for the conquering. They were a mysterious seafaring group long considered to be one of the reasons for the Great Bronze Age collapse. They raided coastal cities, looting and plundering as they went, often leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. Oh, so they're not even conquering. They're just like, no, we're just going to take your and leave. In the short span of around 100 years, great cities were razed to the ground, once powerful civilizations fell never to recover, and the area witnessed death and devastation on an unknown scale. Those that survived the collapse were thrust into the Dark Age, where much of the writing system were lost, since only 10% of the population could read or write and they didn't quite make it. Trade relations faltered, and the quality of life for your average citizen was greatly reduced. The glorious Bronze Age was over. The mysterious people from the sea. The Sea Peoples is a collective name for a loosely allied band of marauders that arrived on the scene when things started to fall apart, but we don't know much about them. The name Sea Peoples was given to the travelling band of bandits by French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in 1881. Gaston's a good name, right? I know it's like super French, or Gaston, or whatever, but it's a good name. Gaston. However, the Sea Peoples is a bit of a misnomer. While many of them arrived in the Mediterranean by sea, there are also many descriptions of them arriving by wagons, so unless the wagons floated and the oxen swam through the Mediterranean, which would be quite a sight, they came across land as well, leading modern researchers to refer to them more accurately as the Land and Seas People. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? It's also like, as opposed to, it's like, for indoor or outdoor use only. Right. Thank you. That's very helpful.
It works both ways.
For a long time, the Sea Peoples was considered one of the causes of the Bronze Age collapse, but today they're considered to be a symptom of the time rather than a cause. Many reports of the Sea Peoples mention them traveling with their families and even livestock, which doesn't really fit the idea of pirates taking advantage of weakened kingdoms to loot and plunder. Instead, researchers believe that the disasters plaguing the Mediterranean led to mass migrations as desperate people fled their homes and set off with their families to find a better life elsewhere. That sounds like exactly what's happened. Rather than like, oh yeah, what caused the Bronze Age collapse? Well, all these people arrived and raided. It sounds like all of these disasters happened, right? And then somewhere in the disaster area are these land and sea peoples, and they're like, well, this, we got to get out of here and go somewhere else. And they go somewhere else and they do all their conquering and that just sounds like, there we go, mystery solved. We still don't know who they are, but that sounds way more likely than it's like, what happens? They arrived on boats and destroyed civilizations. I mean, that's a better clickable thing and something perfect for the History Channel, but it doesn't really seem real, does it? Unfortunately, the Sea Peoples themselves never wrote anything down, or if they did, it has either been destroyed or it's still waiting to be found. Thus, all the records we have about this mysterious group were written by those they attacked, leaving us with subjective and biased accounts. Much of what we know about the Sea Peoples comes from the birthplace of meticulous record-keeping, Egypt. According to Egyptian inscriptions, the Sea Peoples weren't a single group. It was a loosely allied group made up of about 9 separate states or tribes, the Shardana or Shurdan, depending on the translation, as well as Luka, Teresh, Ekwesh, Shekelesh, Peliset. Okay, so a bunch of groups with names that I'm definitely pronouncing wrong. And to be honest, could we pronounce them right anyway? Do people really know what ancient Egyptian sounded like? Is that one of those ones where it's like Latin? It's like there's not really correct pronunciations because people don't know how it sounded in the modern day. So I think I can get away with it, but I'm still not going to try. There's a bunch of groups of people grouped together, doing together, like allies. Together, these tribes apparently formed an alliance to take out the great powers of the Near East and Mediterranean. The Egyptian reliefs of the Sea Peoples also give us a good idea of what they looked like, how they dressed, what weapons they used, and what kind of ships they traveled with. While this might seem like a wealth of information, it doesn't answer the most important questions, but we'll get to that in a bit. The first mention of tribes that would later become part of the Sea Peoples shows up in the records of Ramesses II. During the mid to late Bronze Age, Egypt was a kingdom to be reckoned with, governing an empire that extended north through Sinai, up the Palestine coast into Syria, and down the Nile into Nubia. During the 4th year of Ramesses II's reign, Shurdan pirates attacked the Egyptian delta. Ramesses II defeated them quite easily and incorporated the survivors into his own army, and they eventually became an important mercenary contingent. In around 1286 BCE, Ramesses II and the Hittites clashed at Kadesh over control of Syria, and both armies used mercenaries whose names would later appear on the list of tribes that made up the troublesome Sea Peoples. The Laka and Denyen fought on the side of the Hittites, while the Shurdan fought on the side of the Egyptians. To the great relief of everyone, the Egyptians and the Hittites signed a peace treaty in 1268 BCE, leading to a stable political setup in the Near East. The Sea Peoples show up again in Egypt around 1208 BCE, the 5th year of the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah, son of Ramesses II. Egypt was dealing with attacks from one of their oldest and fiercest enemies to the west, Libya. However, Libya wasn't standing alone. It had help in the form of allies only described as northerners, which is a tad bit vague. It was a large battle for the ancient world, and by the end of it, over 6,000 Libyans and 1,000 of their Sea Peoples lay dead. The Victory Stele, found in 1896 at the Temple of Meneptah in Thebes, tells the story of how Meneptah heroically and wisely overwhelmed the enemy and even provides a list of tribes that allied with Libya. Lots of them are kind of unpronounceable. We're not sure why these tribes allied themselves with Libya and what their motivations were for attacking Egypt, but they were defeated, so clearly they chose to back the wrong horse. 30 years later, the Sea Peoples were back again. It kind of feels like Sea Peoples is just what anyone refers to as generic outsiders from far away. You know? Because they don't know any better.
You've done well, my friend.
Reliefs on the wall of Ramesses III mortuary temple in Medinet Habu, Thebes, describe the Battle of the Delta that took place around 1175 BCE between the forces of Egypt and Sea People invaders. The inscription on the outer wall of the second pylon is one of the longest hieroglyphic inscriptions ever found, suggesting it was a pretty important battle. Depictions of Egyptian galleys with their lion-hearted prows bravely facing off against the enemy galleys with birds' heads carved into the bow and stern tell the story of a great battle. The Battle of the Delta holds a special place in the annals of naval history, since it was the first ever described clash of fighting ships. Ramesses III first launched a defense across land, and the Egyptians, armed to the teeth, crushed the invading army. However, our wily pharaoh also realized that a second attack would come from the sea, as there were reports that the enemy ships were chilling off the coasts of Gaza. It's also one of those things that's like, yeah, the pharaoh did that, and the pharaoh did this. How much of this do you think's actually true? Because it's like, this dude's just some Nepo baby. He's like just Ramesses II's son. I'm sure Ramesses was the Nepo baby of Ramesses I. And it's like, how skilled do you think he was? He was probably just like really inbred and shit. But they're like, no, he's basically God. So, yeah. Even though all these brilliant military tacticians came up with that, it was the pharaoh. It was always the pharaoh. Everyone else must be forgotten. It was the pharaoh. Carve it in his grave. Carve? That's not a word. Inscribe. Or carve. He was correct. Of course he was, that giant big brain Nepo baby. And when the invading fleet finally moved toward the mouth of the Nile, the Egyptian forces were ready and waiting for them. Ramesses III had everything that could float. It was Ramesses III, so he's like Ramesses II's Nepo baby, who was the Nepo baby of Ramesses I. Look, I don't know how this is royalty everywhere. Nepo babies. He had them filled with valiant warriors and archers lying in wait. Along the shores of the Nile, archers were waiting in the papyrus reed beds to provide some additional firepower. The invaders, perhaps having grown overconfident with their many victories up and down the coast, crushing the Hittites, Cyprus, the city of Ugarit, as well as the kingdoms of Mycenae, sailed right into the trap, with the archers on the riverbed raining down arrows, forcing the enemy fleet forwards. Ramesses ordered his ships to block the exit of the Nile, trapping the invaders. Oh, Ramesses, you giant big brain, I'm sure it was all you. Using grappling hooks to hold the vessels, grappling hooks that he invented. No, I made that up. But, you get the drift. The Egyptians boarded the Sea People's ships, slaughtering them. The Battle of the Delta was a great victory for Ramesses III, as he finally managed to succeed where the other great kingdoms had failed. He slew the Denya, turned the Jekka and the Peliset into ashes, and changed the discord status of the Sheridan and Weshesh from playing civilizations to not available. According to the Great Harris Papyrus, named after Anthony Charles Harris, who discovered it in a tomb near Medinet Abbey, Ramesses III followed in the footsteps of his ancestor and also included the Sheridan as mercenaries in his great army, giving them land to settle with their wives and children. He provided them with jobs, and once they were settled, he taxed them to make sure they felt like they were a part of that great Egyptian family. Ah, yes, nothing to make you feel welcome like taxes. Nothing says welcome like paying taxes. Yes! Ilsa and I, same page. However, there seems to be a bit of confusion on this point. Some sources claim that Ramesses II incorporated the Sheridan into his army, while others claim it was Ramesses III. However, other sources state that both pharaohs had the same idea. Unfortunately, I can't read hieroglyphics, so I can't check the primary sources, but once Duolingo launches a course on hieroglyphics, I'll get right on that. So Duolingo is this free app. I think it's free. Anyway, and it lets you learn another language. And I've messed around with Duolingo and to learn Czech. And I've just found it generally like, wow, I'm getting really good at this. Like, you get very good at Duolingo. It doesn't teach you to be very good at a language. It seems to just teach you to be very good at solving Duolingo puzzles. And it's like, as soon as you actually take that into the real world, you're like, oh no, not everyone is speaking in these neatly arranged sentences. And when I read things, it's not just about filling in random gaps. So, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of Duolingo. And then a friend of mine was like, dude, I've done like 900 days of Duolingo. And then I'll be like, and how's your check coming? And he's like, I don't know, but I've done 900 days of Duolingo. It's like, dude, my check's better than yours. And I haven't learned it in 3 years. From the Egyptian inscriptions, it seems that while the Sea Peoples were wiping out the other great civilizations, Egypt had no problem dealing with these upstarts. The problem with Egyptian inscriptions is that the scribes writing them were more concerned with aesthetics, religion, and not getting executed by petty pharaohs, rather than historical accuracy. If the inscriptions are to be believed, every exiting pharaoh left the country in chaos, and it was up to the next pharaoh to step in and restore order. Oh, okay. So maybe after the... I guess they're like, well, that god's dead and we've got a new god now, so we have to talk about the old god because finally he can't smite us. And which is interesting because it also seems like all of this is like praising the pharaohs for being geniuses when they're like probably inbred. So either Egypt was an incredibly unstable country which would have made it hard to be big and prosperous as it was, or we need to take all of these dramatic accounts of pharaohs saving the day with a pinch of salt. It's definitely that. It's definitely the latter. While our main source of information on the Sea Peoples is Egypt, the troublesome warriors are also mentioned in royal correspondence from Ugarit and Cyprus. According to these letters, the combined fleet of the Sea Peoples had massed off the southwestern tip of the Anatolian Peninsula, from where they attacked the western coast of Cyprus. Battles also occurred on the Anatolian mainland, and the great king of the Hittite Empire had to turn to his allies, the port city of Ugarit in northern Syria, for extra troops and supplies to fight off the invading force. We really don't know where these dudes came from. It's like, so they're just all a bunch of people who got together, but where from? However, Ugarit was itself under threat by the Sea Peoples. The young king of Ugarit wrote that the enemy ships had already landed, setting fire to the towns and doing great damage to the country. Since much of Ugarit's troops had already been sent to Hittite country to provide assistance, and many of their ships were stationed in Lycia, Ugarit was left poorly defended. Sadly, this cry for help never reached the Allies. In fact, it never left Ugarit. The clay tablet was found by archaeologists in a kiln waiting to be fired before being sent thousands of years later. Wow, they destroyed you real quick, didn't they? I'm chiseling out this message calling for help. It didn't even get sent. It didn't even get essentially printed. It was just like some dude did it and it's like, that's it. Or I guess not chiseled out. If it was going in a kiln, you just draw it with your fingers. God, the past was Archaeological excavations of Ugarit provide a rare glimpse into the time of the Sea People's invasion. Ugarit, at the height of its power, was wiped off the map. Bronze arrowheads, ash from burnt buildings, and broken ceramics were all that remains. There's one more letter written by the scribes of the great king of the Hittites, describing a victory on the side of the Hittite kingdom against the fearsome Sea Peoples, but it would be the last. Not long after this final victory, the Hittite kingdom fell before the marauders, and, like all of those that came before, it was burnt to the ground, never to recover. Wow, these Sea Peoples, what's that it called? I made a video about it on my War of Graphics channel. Scorched Earth. They're just take all your kill all your people and burn you to the ground. Why? Why not just keep the towns? It seems so wasteful. Where did they come from, and where did they go? Egyptian inscriptions usually describe the alliance of tribes as coming from the midst of the sea or from the islands, which is where the name Sea Peoples originally came from. Unfortunately, none of these records tell us exactly where these tribes called home. It's possible that their origins were common knowledge at the time, since everybody knew where the Sea Peoples hailed from, so there was no need to write it down. We do know that the ancient Egyptians viewed the Sea Peoples as invaders, and we have the detailed list naming every tribe that made up the loose alliance today known as the Sea Peoples. So, as is often the case in cop shows, we have a name, but we don't have an address. However, most researchers seem to agree that they initially came from Asia Minor, the Aegean, the Balkans, and Cyprus. Boom! Mystery solved. Thanks for watching. Nah, we're halfway. However, where they came from is just one part of the mystery. Once the dust settled and the Bronze Age had bid farewell, most of the Sea Peoples themselves seemed to disappear along with it. It's probably because they burned all the down. They were like, oh, now what are we going to eat? We burned and salted all the land. For the most part, researchers are relying on philology. What is that? The study of languages in historical sources was very specific, to figure out where these tribes came from and where they ended up. But so far, we have nothing definitive to prove any particular theory. The Sea Peoples and Homer. While we have written accounts of the Sea Peoples invading Egypt and wiping out Ugarit and the Hittite kingdom, the role of the Sea Peoples in the fall of Mycenae is a little unclear. However, some theories suggest that at least some of the tribes that made up the Sea Peoples can be traced back to Mycenae. Based on archaeological finds, researchers believe that during the Middle Bronze Age, Mycenae was dominated by an elite class, focusing on production and trade. However, by the Late Bronze Age, this changed and the elite had been replaced by a warrior class. The Mycenaean Empire controlled the Aegean and Greece from separate city-states, depending on this strong warrior class for control. During this time, piracy became popular in the region, and according to... Thucydides? I bet this is one of those dudes. And if I was pronouncing it properly, I'd be like, oh yeah, I've heard of him. But I'm not. Thucydides? That could be it. Thucydides? That sounds more familiar. An Athenian historian and general. At one stage, piracy was even considered honorable and a favorite pastime of the elite. Now that sounds kind of awesome. Is that what you're doing this weekend? Touch of piracy? Just going out on my boats? Gonna plunder some gold?
That's got to be the best pirate I've ever seen.
However, piracy, like most shipping pursuits in the Mediterranean, was a seasonal thing, so how the elite entertain themselves out of season is a topic for another time. This shift from production and trade to warrior class engaging in piracy coincides with the decline and eventual destruction of Mycenae and other settlements in the Aegean. How much of this decline and destruction can be laid at the feet of the pirates is up for debate, but I'm fairly sure they had a hand in the resulting chaos. In fact, many settlements relocated to more defensible positions further away from the coast, both inland and on coastal hilltops, probably because of a new, more serious threat coming at them from the waves. This trend of relocation and piracy wasn't restricted to the Greek mainland and surrounding islands. Similar population movements also occurred in Etruria, today known as Italy. Despite being a great civilization, the Mycenaean city-states didn't actually need any outside enemies. The piracy wasn't the only problem. The city-states themselves were often at each other's throats. This constant warfare between the various city-states, along with other disasters, greatly weakened the Mycenaean civilization, making them ripe for the taking, and the Sea Peoples were happy to oblige. However, at the end of the day, we don't know if the Sea Peoples had anything to do with the fall of Mycenae. It's entirely possible that the ancient Greeks destroyed themselves with a helping hand from a wrathful god and a volcano or two. This was interesting, right? Like, over history, civilizations have been destroyed. And I live in a civilization. Like, we all live in a civilization. Like, this whole modern global thing that we've got going on. And it's like, this come pretty close to destruction in, like, twice in the last 100 or so years. And I'm like, that's kind of nuts. It's like, how... And now we can destroy ourselves really easily with, like, big bombs and stuff. So it's like, how much longer is our civilization going to go on for? Because before we reset it and have to go back and, I don't know. Like, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, nothing's forever. It's all going to change eventually, like, over a big enough time frame. It's kind of depressing, isn't it? I mean, I'll be long dead, fortunately. In Homer's... I mean, I hope so. Like, I hope civilization doesn't collapse in my lifetime. That'd be a bit miserable. But now having kids, I'm like, oh man, I hope civilization doesn't collapse in my kids' lifetime. And then when I have grandkids, I'll probably feel the same way, although slightly less so. Which is weird, isn't it? Like, because I'm like, I'm getting on in my years now. It's like, I don't see there's a possibility, like, I'm going to get drafted into a war. I'd say that's fairly unlikely. When I was a kid, I was kind of like, man, there were wars in the past. Like, studying history, I'd be like, God damn, there was like 2 major wars, like, within my grandparents' lifetime, where people were getting drafted and having to go and work in the trenches and get shot. And I'm like, that sounds bad. And I was kind of like, that could happen again. And then I'd have to go off and fight in a war, which would be rubbish. And now I've got kids, I'm like, it all resets because I'm like, God damn, I really hope there's not a war within the like next 30 years or whatever, because then they'll have to go off and fight in a war. And I'm like, that's rubbish. When do you stop getting drafted? I'm 36. How many more years do I have to wait before I'm safe from getting drafted? And then I suppose it depends how bad the war goes, right? Because at some point you could be like Russia and you're like, yeah, no, we need 60-year-olds. Or whatever, and it's like, oh, what are they doing? Oh, they're at the front lines because they're the most disposable. And it's like, no, I don't want that. God, I hope there's no war. In Homer's tale, Odysseus claims to have launched his raids from Crete and describes a similar tactic used by raiding parties attacking the Hittite kingdom from a captured port in Cyprus. Traveling in small groups instead of large fleets to ensure stealth and speed, the raiders would often beach their vessels, allowing warriors to disembark and raid quickly, thus preventing their chosen target from mounting a proper defense. How else would they do it? What are you going to do? Just like anchor your boat offshore and be like, all right, everyone, get into the smaller boats and row ashore real slowly in vulnerable small groups. Or worse yet, just swim. Surely beaching seems to be the only sensible way to do an invasion. Depictions of Hellenic oared galleys show keel extensions that made this beaching tactic possible. Similar keel extensions can be seen on Sea People's vessels in the depiction of the Battle of the Delta in hieroglyphics at Medinet Habu, further suggesting a link to Mycenae. According to inscriptions on the Tanis stele commissioned by Ramesses II, the Sheridan had been raiding coastal settlements including Egypt for several years. If the Sheridan raids were seasonal, as was the case with most shipping endeavors at the time, they could possibly have been raiding for 9 years, coinciding with Odysseus' claim of leading 9 raids. When Ramesses II finally defeated and captured this troublesome foe, he chose to welcome them into Egypt and made them part of Egyptian society instead of throwing them in prisons or using them as slave labor. How generous of him. I mean, I don't know why I said that sarcastically. It's really generous. I don't know. There was no reason to say that sarcastically. It's like, that's really nice that he's like, he didn't make them slaves. Ramesses II, good guy. By the 5th year of the reign of Ramesses II, the Sheridan already made up part of the pharaoh's bodyguard and assisted him with the battle against the Hittite army. By the reign of Ramesses V, as seen in the Wilbur Papyrus, a land registry, the Sheridan were landowners and they could pass down land from one generation to the next. In keeping with the story of the Sheridan in Homer's work, Odysseus claims that after his defeat, he lived and worked in Egypt, accumulating some wealth. So if we consider the parallels between the two stories, I suppose it's possible that the Sheridan, at least, possibly came from Mycenae and finally settled in Egypt. However, some sources say that they ended up in Sardinia. This is the problem with the past. It's like, yeah, maybe this, maybe that. Maybe we could just rely on this book, which might be fiction. Who knows? Historians in the past weren't so much concerned with, history. They seem to be more concerned with, let's tell a good story. The Sheridan might not have been the only tribe hailing from ancient Greece. According to researchers, the inscriptions of Pharaoh Meneptah could point to the Equish tribe also originating from Greece. The Equish is only mentioned once by Meneptah, and they showed up in Egypt after the Trojan War. For the sake of this script, we'll assume it was an actual battle and debate the historical accuracy of Homer and the existence of giant wooden horses another day. That's what I'm saying. It's maybe history, maybe just a story, who knows? Some modern scholars believe that Equish was the Egyptian pronunciation for Achaoi. It's quite different, isn't it? An ancient word for Achaeans, the name for the Mycenaean era Greeks. This theory suggests that the Equish tribe were the remnants of the Trojan War, a band of renegades that first besieged and sacked Troy, and once that was done, hopped on their ships and set off for Egypt to repeat the exercise. Wait, who was who? It doesn't matter, I'm not sure. I've got a little bit confused with all of these, random tribes and stuff, but it seems like historians are also confused, so we're just going to assume that that's okay. Of course, that didn't end well for them. Perhaps staying on their own side of the Mediterranean would have been a safer bet. Were the Philistines originally the Sea Peoples? However, the Sheridan and Equish aren't the only tribes considered to have roots in ancient Greece. Another tribe theorized to possibly originate from the area is the Peliset. According to inscriptions by Ramesses III, he took the Peliset captive after the battle in the Nile Delta and had all the leaders of the tribe killed. Whether this is fact or just boasting is unclear. Some researchers are of the opinion that Peliset was settled in modern-day Palestine and is better known today as the Philistines from the Bible. All of this is just someone thinks this, someone thinks that. Ancient history, so much guessing. Maybe we can also rely on the Bible for some historical facts. The Bible states that the Philistines originally came from Kaftor, which some historians have identified as ancient Crete. However, Cyprus, the islands of the Aegean, or even Cappadocia in Asia Minor, have also been suggested as being the ancient city of Kaftor. The Philistines settled in Palestine and is often associated with 5 city-states. The writers of the Bible clearly considered the Philistines as a foreign group arriving in Canaan from distant shores. Unfortunately, the Bible is a bit of a problematic source historically. Yeah, no shit. That Old Testament section especially is and then they were in a garden. Oh, they were they? Oh, and then he ate a rib or something like that. Sounds real. I know the Old Testament's not really real, but the New Testament's also historically well dodgy. However, the archaeological record supports the idea that the Philistines were a